This video will go over creating a simple user interface for an Embrio PC project. Start by creating a new project. Give the project a name and make sure the base location is correct. Change the hardware target dropdown to PC and leave the Create Form Template checkbox checked. Press Create Project. Notice that because the Create Form Template checkbox was checked, this project starts with 4 files. The first file is a regular agent. The files in the Forms folder are new file types specific to a Forms project. First, open the control agent. It has 2 nodes. One node that exposes the main form and a startup trigger that activates the main form when the project starts. You can open a form node to see a preview of the form. A project can have multiple forms. Firing the Make Active input trigger will make that form active, and only one form can be active at a time. An Embrio form is basically a node with a user interface. Forms are created by writing HTML, CSS, and jQuery like you would a web page. Like a node, a form exposes inputs and outputs that can be attached to from other nodes or agents. Also like a node, you write your code handlers that fire when input values change and update the display controls on the form. When input values on the form change, jQuery event handlers set the form node's output values. To open the form editor, double-click on the form file in the project tree, or double-click on the form node. The form editor has a lot of similarities to the node editor, with a few additions. The columns on the sides are where you add inputs and outputs. Mouse over the Add buttons to see the type, and click to add the item. Use the configuration buttons next to the inputs and outputs to update them. These are exactly the same as in the node editor. The top centers the form preview, which shows a live version of your form. Pressing the Save button in the middle area or pressing Ctrl+S will save the form and update the preview. The bottom area is where you do all of your code and markup editing. The Update Condition drop-down box is the same as on the node editor. You have access to the startup, shutdown, and every update events, as well as a handler for any input triggers and as many input change events as you need. To create a new input changed event, press the plus sign next to the drop-down and check the box next to any input which should fire this code when its input changes. The top of this drop-down has the form-specific selections: HTML, Includes, CSS, and JavaScript. The HTML tab has a template bit of HTML to get us started. Notice that there is no headers area and no HTML or body tag like you would see on a regular HTML page. When a form runs, its HTML is injected into a container page, so don't add these tags to your form. Instead, the form HTML starts with a div with a class called container. The second selection is the Includes tab. This is where you set which project scope CSS and script files to include on this form. By default, a form project has a script and a style file, which are included by the main form. The script and CSS files are in the Forms folder in the project tree. The CSS file has a few classes to get started, but you can replace this with whatever you want. The JavaScript drop-down selection shows the JavaScript specific to this form. Shared JavaScript should go into the script file in the project tree. This script starts with a document ready event, which fires when the form loads. This is where you can set up your form. Embrio forms by default include jQuery and jQuery.ui. Finally, we have the CSS section. Again, any styles here will apply only to this form. Add project-wide styles to the style file in the project tree. Now I will go over how to display data on a form and get user input from a form. First, I will go back to the HTML tab and create a p tag to show some text. Notice this layout is only there for a convenient starting point. Feel free to get rid of this HTML and add your own from scratch. I give the p tag an ID of label display so that I can access it from my code. To access form controls from Embrio code, the controls must have an ID value. Make sure that your ID values are unique. For this demonstration, I will print an integer value in the label. From the Add Input menu, I click on the integer icon and leave the default range alone. I want to update the form when the input value changes, so I press the plus icon next to the Update Condition dropdown to make a new onChange event. Then I check the box next to the integer input. In the code editor, I simply write label display equals input underscore integer, semicolon. To access HTML form controls, you just type the ID that you gave the control. To access inputs and outputs, you either type input or output, underscore, then the name of the input or output without any spaces. I save the form. When a form saves, all of its input changed events fire, so now my form is displaying a 0. I go back to the control agent and open my form node. Notice the integer input that I just added is exposed on the form node, and that dragging the input updates the form. Next, I will add a button on the form which will fire a trigger output when it is clicked. First, I add a new trigger output and rename it to clicked. In my HTML, I will add a button to the form under the label. Do this by using a regular HTML input tag. I write input type equals button, value equals click me, ID equals button1, and close the tag. I save the form and now I can see my button. I will use a jQuery handler to handle the click event and trigger the node output. You could wire this up manually, or I can right-click on the button in the form preview, and the click event is added to my document ready code block. You can right-click on any HTML input element to automatically wire it up like this. Again, to access the output trigger, all I do is write output_clicked to get a reference to the trigger output. Then I type .trigger, open and close parenthesis, semicolon to fire it. I save the form, and now when I click on the button, the output trigger fires. Finally, right-click on the UI project's controller node in the project tree and click on the Show Form pop-up. This shows a full-size active version of your UI project. Note that you can click on the button and see the output fire in the node screen editor. This pop-up shows the form as it actually is, whereas in the node screen editor, sometimes other CSS classes can interfere with the rendering of the form preview. Notice the spacing around the button is a little different in these two views. I like to keep a form preview open on my second monitor while I work on a form project. If you have an Embrio license, you can export the program by right-clicking on the controller node in the project tree and selecting Compile Controller. Select a root folder and an exe name. A new folder with this name will be created in the selected root folder. Select which type of computer the program should run on, then click Compile Controller. After a moment, you should get a success message and a button to open the new folder. This is your executable program. For Windows programs, simply double-click the exe file. See the documentation for more details on getting Embrio and Embrio-compiled programs to run on your computer.